Last week, we heard about symptoms associated with the conditions.
Pain, the brain, the energy drain, and oh, I wish I could sleep again.
Today, we'll hear about help available to chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia patients.
There are medications that have been developed to treat these disorders, and there are approaches that help patients significantly, so treatment is available.
I'm Vic Gregory, and let's get connected. Last time on Weekend Connection, we were talking with Dr. Charles Lapp. He is the founder of the Hunter Hopkins Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, and his is one of only a few clinics in America that specializes in diagnosing and treating chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia patients. And last week, we took the majority of our time to discuss the debilitating symptoms of these conditions and the medical community's ability to treat them. As we ran out of time last week, we were just beginning to discuss treatment that is available to chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia patients, and we'd like to pick up on that discussion today. And so, Dr. Lapp, once again, we welcome you to our Weekend Connection broadcast.
Thank you for the opportunity.
As we wrapped up last time, Dr. Lapp had communicated about some of the medications showing promise when used to treat chronic fatigue patients, and I would like to begin today by going over that information again.
Since 1988, I've been involved in the study of a drug called Ampligen or rintatolimod. And this drug has had some success in the management of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. And we've known for a number of years that some patients, the kind of patient that has the flu-like feelings, feeling sore throat, swollen glands, feverishness, chills, aching all over, these patients tend to have a high level of what we call cytokines in the blood. And these cytokines can be suppressed by drugs that you see every day on TV, like Enbrel and Humira and Remicade that are advertised regularly. So we're finding some treatments that might be helpful, and it's going to be a matter of refining those treatments and testing them specifically in chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia.
Very good. At your clinic, you have a holistic approach to treatment for chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia patients, and it's referred to as stepwise. Take some time, if you will, and let us know what that entails.
I'd be glad to, yeah. We came up with the idea many years ago that you have to take things in steps. And so we start obviously with the evaluation to find out what the patient's problems are. The next step would be to educate the patient as to what they have. And that can be such a relief to patients. So many of the patients come to us and they've been to doctor after doctor or specialist after specialist, and they still don't have a diagnosis. And to have that evaluation and then be educated that the symptoms that they're experiencing are normal, they're typical of the illness, it can relieve a lot of tension, a lot of stress in their lives. So the next step then is to talk about basic things like diet, for example, and we find that many of our patients are sensitive to gluten. Many of our patients are sensitive to lactose, which is a milk sugar, and so they have to stay away from dairy products and products that have a lot of wheat in them. Over the years, we found that many of our patients don't tolerate what we call the SCANT foods. SCANT is an acronym. S is for sugar, C is for caffeine, A is for alcohol, N is for NutraSweet, or aspartame, which is the artificial sweetener, and T is for toxins. And the toxins are things like MSG, for example, in foods can bother a lot of our patients. Some of the nightshade vegetables like what would be a nightshade vegetable? Green peppers. Tomatoes are a nightshade vegetable. Sometimes our patients don't tolerate those very well. So we look at diet, and then the next step would be to look at activity, because we do know from many, many studies that activity is important. No one gets better just staying in bed.
Right.
And that's the tendency. When you feel tired, the tendency is to crawl into a chair or a sofa or a bed and just stay there. But we know it's important to stay active, but not so active that you trigger these flares and relapses. So we talk about being active, and we actually come up with exercise programs for patients. And then next we treat the symptoms, obviously. Most important are to treat the sleep dysfunction. So to improve insomnia. And the second one is to manage the pain, if pain is a major issue for patients. And then lastly, we treat the comorbid conditions, because people that have chronic fatigue syndrome, the vast majority also have other medical problems like irritable bowel or an overactive bladder or migraines, or they have low vitamin D levels, or they have endometriosis. In fact, we've identified at least 33 comorbid conditions that occur more commonly in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia. Wow. So it's important to address those as well.
Do you find the patients who are treated in the fashion that you've described are able to experience a more active and less debilitating lifestyle?
Absolutely. Many years ago, we did a longitudinal study to see how patients fared. And that's before we became a tertiary clinic. So we were seeing the general population. So it was a more accurate study. And what we found was that when patients followed such a course as this, 60% improved. Many got back to normal or near normal. So they essentially had a remission. And then there's 40% of people who improved, but then they sort of got on a plateau or they stabilized at a certain level. And even over time, we saw some of them improve remarkably too. So no way to predict who's in the recovery group, if you will, or who's in the plateau group. But certainly we saw those two groups. What we didn't see is we didn't see a progressive illness. It's not like cancer or ALS or MS where things go steadily downhill over time. It's not a progressive illness that way. And we don't see people who die of chronic fatigue syndrome or die of fibromyalgia. So that's the good part. That's the good part.
Your stepwise treatment plan is discussed at your website. And if somebody wanted to visit your website and take a look at that plan, what would the website address be?
It's just drlapp.com, drlapp.com,
all right,
or drlapp.net. Either one will get you there.
All right, very good. I see that you were also involved in the development of an online resource called Treating Chronic Fatigue Syndrome and Fibromyalgia as an Integrated Approach. What was the purpose behind that website?
Vic, the purpose behind that was to help people who couldn't get to a specialty clinic. There are perhaps 5 or 6 specialty clinics in the whole country, and an estimated 2 million patients with chronic fatigue syndrome and 2 to 6 million patients with fibromyalgia. So you do the math. We can't see all those patients.
Right.
And so it was necessary to come up with a way that patients that couldn't get to a specialty clinic could find a way to get better, could find a path, could follow that stepwise approach. And so a colleague of mine, Bruce Campbell, who was a chronic illness specialist from Stanford University at the time, we got together and we developed a website that sort of took the stepwise approach. And it works just like that. You start with step 1 and you evaluate where you are, and step 2 is come up with a plan, and number 3, keep implementing it and keep going from there. So I think it could be very, very helpful. And we have thousands of people every year, thousands who, in fact, it's tens of thousands, who go to that site and get benefit from it because we track that.
That would be my next question. Do you find that patients utilizing that website and yet who don't have access to a doctor who understands how to treat the conditions, do you find that those patients are actually benefiting and getting better as they are following the stepwise process?
I can't answer that question because it's anonymous. We don't know who's getting on the website. We just know how many hits we get and how long they spend on the website. And we know there are a lot of hits and they spend a lot of time on the website. But we can't track back and actually ask people how they're doing on that website. But certainly it's a very popular site. And, there's another site, too. There's another self-help site for people that might be interested in it that Dr. Campbell runs himself. And he's been doing this for many, many years now, where for a small fee, you can get on a listserv with Dr. Campbell and his moderators, and they will send you a textbook And one day a week, they send you an assignment to read a chapter in the textbook, and then do a little homework assignment, which might be something like 5 things I did this week that made me feel worse. And when you send those to the group, then everybody in the whole group gets those answers, and you get everybody else's answers. And so you can comment on those reports, and it's turned out to be a wonderful way of learning how to deal with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia.
Okay, well, let's give some information. Number one, what would be the website address for the resource referred to as Treating Chronic Fatigue Syndrome and Fibromyalgia as an Integrated Approach?
It's very easy. It's treatcfsfm.org.
Okay.
treatcfsfm.org. And the website that's done like a class, that's called CFIDS. selfhelp.org. So CFIDS is another name that early on was the patients gave that name to chronic fatigue. So they didn't like that fatigue word in there, and so they wanted to make it sound a little bit more impressive. So they started calling it Chronic Fatigue Immune Dysfunction Syndrome, or CFIDS.
Right.
And this site was developed way back when. So it's called cfidsselfhelp.org.
All right, and we'll keep both of those website addresses on file so that if people need to call us here at BBN, we'll have that information for them. And we're just about out of time, Dr. Lapp. As we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to share with our listeners that we haven't already covered?
Well, I think we've covered it, but I've always liked to emphasize that chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia are real illnesses. Patients will sometimes go to a doctor, and the doctor will say, "Well, I don't think that's real," and I think that maybe it's just all in your head. Right. But the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control, the AMA, the American College of Rheumatology, many fine and very knowledgeable groups understand that chronic fatigue syndrome is real. There was a 300-page booklet written by the National Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Medicine, and the very first statement in there is this is a real and debilitating illness. So despite the fact that it's an invisible illness and people don't look sick, they have very severe symptoms, and it's very disabling. At least in our practice, at least 50% of the patients that we see are totally disabled or at least unable to work on a regular basis. So it's a very disabling thing. And the other thing I always tell people is that treatment is available. Many doctors have said, I can diagnose it, but there's nothing I can do about it. And that's just not true. You can go to our website, you can go to the other sites that we've talked about, and you can see that there are medications that have been developed to treat these disorders, and there are approaches that help patients significantly. So treatment is available, and it's not psychiatric.
Well, the old axiom says that knowledge is power. And hopefully we've empowered our listeners who suffer with chronic fatigue and or fibromyalgia to have some hope in finding relief from the symptoms that they experience with these conditions. We've been talking with Dr. Charles Lapp. He is the founder of the Hunter Hopkins Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, one of only a few clinics in the United States that treat chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia patients, and we have been discussing proper diagnosis of and treatment for chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. Dr. Lapp, thank you again for joining us today.
Again, thank you for the opportunity.
That's our broadcast. Next week, Stephen Brown will be your host, and he'll address another topic of interest for the Christian community. And we invite you to join us next week at 402-302 Central for Weekend Connection here on the Bible Broadcasting Network. Weekend Connection is a public service production of BBN.
Thank you for listening to this feature, a production of BBN, the Bible Broadcasting Network. BBN provides 24-hour Christian programming, great Christian music, and Bible teaching. Listen to BBN by clicking the link in the description.